Good afternoon. I'm Marianne Wilson, editor of Chain Store Age, and I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Building EV Charging Stations, What Retailers Need to Know. It's being sponsored by Sevan Multi-Site Solutions. Before we start, just a few brief housekeeping points. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to send questions through the presentation. It's on the left side of the screen below the presenter headshots. We'll field as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation, but if we don't have time to answer your question, our sponsor will follow up by email after the session ends. Also, you can use the section down on the left if you have any technical questions through the webinar. You'll get a direct reply from our webinar producer. Finally, if you want to review this webinar later or share it with a colleague, a replay will be available on the Chain Store Age site within about 2 hours of our conclusion today. It will be available for several months. Okay, that does it with the housekeeping. Let's get on with today's webinar. I'm going to hand things over to David Hendrix. David?
Thank you, Marianne. I appreciate everybody's time today. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you. So my name is David Hendrix. I am the Chief Commercial Officer with Sevan Multi-Site Solutions. Been in the industry for around 15 years as a whole. My role within Sevan Multi-Site Solutions is really centered around growth, sales, marketing, messaging, etc. I'm joined today by Mark Kinnare, one of our Senior Vice Presidents of Operations. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, David. Mark Kinnare, everybody, Senior Vice President of Operations at Sevan. Our teams on the operations side at Sevan are responsible for developing and implementing program plans on behalf of multi-site clients regionally and nationally across the country. We work in a lot of different sectors: C-store, retail, restaurant, grocery, healthcare, hospitality, and work with a lot of the best, most well-known iconic brands in the country. In the C-store space, we're working with 7-Eleven, BP, TravelCenters of America, Thornton's in restaurant, McDonald's in retail, Walgreens, Walmart. So we've got a national footprint to help a lot of our clients solve for a lot of multi-site capital spend programs across the country. We're currently working on about 10,000 different store touch locations across the country in 2022, and looking forward to today's conversation, which we have a lot of experience and a lot of subject matter experts on in the EV field. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Mark. Overall, again, as Mark said, we really appreciate your time. We have a vast experience when it comes to multi-site solutions. We thought we'd start off with just a brief overview of who we are and kind of where we've come from. And then from there, we'll start to roll into what is EV charging, some of the trends that come with the electric vehicles and where they're going, the opportunities that have started to really crop up. And then in a nutshell, really where to start from an implementation standpoint if there's interest in ultimately investigating some of this. So who is Sevan? Ultimately, we're a multi-site solutions provider. We're licensed in all 50 states. We have a little over 500 total employees, all W-2. And where we really excel is, in our opinion, as well as some of our customers' opinions, is the remodels, the reimaging, the rollouts, the new builds, etc. Some of the current customers that we've worked with, in addition to what Mark spoke about a few minutes ago, specifically around electric vehicles, is Walgreens, BP, and MFG. And in a nutshell, what Sevan really can do is help you from soup to nuts within any rollout, from design to survey, conditional assessments, permit requirements. We ultimately can help you attain those permits, expedite them where necessary, and then really manage that installation from feasibility and idea all the way to commissioning and ultimately revenue production for you as well as your site. So we thought we would jump in straight to a poll just to really start a little bit of interaction, but also think about just in general where EV charging is. So the poll, I'll read this to you it'll give you a little bit of time to ultimately answer it. But what percentage of consumers indicated that they would consider buying an electric vehicle in the future? So four options there. It looks like we're getting quite a few results so far. We'll give it a couple more seconds for everybody to add their answer. All right. So it looks like for the most part everybody was correct. So when we think about EV charging as a whole, more than 50%, actually 57% of consumers have stated publicly that they plan to buy an electric vehicle by 2030. And so from our perspective and our clients' perspective, we started to ask why and wonder why this is really important. And at the end of the day, it just creates a large opportunity for chain stores to think about where they can grab additional traffic, where they can increase sales, where they can be known. And at the end of the day, the big push with electric vehicles is not only just consumer, but it's also really driven by a number of different organizations like Amazon, FedEx, to name a few. Quite a few Fortune 500 companies have publicly stated that their fleet will go to 100% electric vehicles by 2040. So this isn't going away whatsoever. We are also in the United Kingdom, Sevan Multi-Site Solutions in Europe. And Europe is a little further ahead within these rollouts and ultimately consumer gains from electric vehicles. And chain stores have seen a measurable increase and a huge return from increased sales of having these electric vehicle chargers on site. So again, there's a huge opportunity to take advantage of here with early adopters, really create awareness of your brand as well as drive traffic and ultimately sales within that footprint. So EV pricing and performance, I think we all remember when the first electric vehicle came out, it was really low range, took almost days to charge. Clearly that has advanced over time from a technology standpoint. By 2030, we do expect the range to continue to increase to more than 400 miles in one charge. The battery packs ultimately will come down in cost, almost 40 to 50% of what exists today. And then at the same time, with that increased range, the lower cost from a battery pack, as the hardware and the technology will continue to increase and allow for lower charge time. So again, a good opportunity just to take advantage of with technology advances. One of the common questions we get a lot just when we're rolling out and helping our clients with adding electric vehicle charging units is the advancement of hardware and what that means from a investment standpoint. Happy to say that hardware really isn't changing that much. So the hardware that is being installed today has a shelf life and an efficacy with updates somewhere between 10 and 15 years with the 4G and 5G technology. So you're not going to have to spend more money in 2 or 3 years to ultimately change that hardware out. It's going to last. You're going to be able to have that sustainable return into the future. When we think about government trends as a whole, a lot of the upward lift within electric vehicles is really centered around what the government's trying to do. Again, that sustainable green initiative and ultimately trying to push forward. And then you get not only the consumers, but also the organizations out there that want to push. So the government has launched a number of different bills. Each state has an opportunity to grab up to $5 billion worth of grants and other monies to help build electric vehicle infrastructure, charging networks. So a lot of money to gain from the government there, and again, being pushed forward. By 2030, it is expected that we have roughly 500,000 charging stations across the nation. So spaced out every 50 miles, again, just from a consumer standpoint. And with the last bill, the United States, the federal government did extend the tax credit of $7,500 or the grants for new EV purchases. So again, that will continue to push up the ultimate consumer demand and need for, as well as opportunity to add electric vehicle charging stations in a number of different places. So this next slide really just shows from a graphical standpoint the growth. You can see on the left-hand side, not very many charging stations, not very many ultimate electric vehicles. In 2020, At the end of 2020, there were roughly 96,000 charging stations. By the end of this year, there's expected to be roughly 113,000. And then you can see really that hockey stick approach with the funding, grants, and opportunities, as well as the rise in people, the consumer-driven behavior of buying these vehicles, that it will hockey stick up to a little over 500,000 by the end of 2030. At this point, I will turn it over to Mr. Kinnare, and he will speak a little bit more about opportunities and then ultimately how to start to think about where and how you add these charging stations to your sites.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so this slide, basically we want to talk about the next 5-10 minutes in the next few slides is about EV charging, your business, and how do you develop a strategy. Thing I just draw attention to on this slide is really in the green there, the words additional revenue. I think that's what we're trying to understand, potential there and how to develop a strategy around that. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to ask another question of everyone, and true false question, hopefully an easy one. You can only earn revenue by charging from EV chargers. True or false? That's about the result I expected, I thought we were going to see. If we go to the next slide, we'll delve into that just a little bit. We're going to talk about some ways to earn additional revenues that include not only charging for the EV charging itself, but there's also marketing, advertising play here. There's some geofencing opportunities that a lot of folks are starting to leverage and take advantage of. There's also a hybrid pricing model that we'll explain in a few minutes. And then the last bullet there we'll talk a little bit about subscription pricing and whether or not that's starting to gain traction and a foothold in this space or not. If we go to the next slide, we want to start by talking about a handful of things to level set, first of all, so we have kind of a baseline understanding, and then we'll talk about strategy and opportunity. First thing we need to talk about are the types of chargers that are available. There is not a universal charging charger in terms of its kilowatt per hour output. The types of charging stations, they're different, and we just want to take a minute and explain a little bit of what those differences are. We can go to the next slide. In a commercial application, it really starts with L2 chargers. Before I jump into that, I just want to point out there is such a thing as an L1 charger, and it's essentially what sits in somebody's home in the garage that provides a charge. Works off of the current electrical requirements you typically find in a home. A full charge on a typical car can take anywhere from 8 hours on the low end on a full charge up to, in some instances, 25, 30 hours to get a full charge. It serves its purpose for people who are charging up overnight over an extended period of time and can get a 200 or 300, 400 mile range on a full charge, but not really applicable in any kind of commercial environment. So today we want to talk about two types of chargers. The first one's an L2, and that's the L2 charger is the standard language that we use in this industry. And it's a standard charger that you're going to see at a lot of public charging stations in the United States. It provides around 20 to 25 miles of range per hour charged. So it'll work in certain commercial applications and in other ones it won't, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But to get a full charge for a car at an L2 station takes about 8 to 10 hours. So again, it'll have a specific application, which we'll talk about in a minute, but not serve its purpose for a lot of other types of applications, especially in the a large segment of the chain store multi-site space. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about the, can you flip ahead? Well, stay in this one, David, I'm sorry. The DCFC is really a fast charger. It stands for a new type of charger that's coming to market. It's significantly faster than the L2 charger. and it can charge 75 to 80% of a car's battery in under 45 minutes, and typically will provide a full charge in less than 90 minutes. More expensive to install, the equipment is more expensive, but the benefit to the customer can be very tangible, specific, depending upon the type of customer, the type of matching it up with the type of retailer in the right environment. If we go to the next slide, we'll start talking about developing strategy. So what's happening in the industry and what we're learning, especially when we study what's taking place over in Europe, as David mentioned, is a little bit ahead of us on the curve in this terms of implementation, in terms of a national strategy, is the strategies are basically being broken down depending upon the type of, the length of dwell time that the EV owner, the car owner is willing to wait for a charge for. So we're breaking it down into 4 segments: a rapid charge, which is in the 10 to 15 minute range, a short charge dwell time, which is less than 30 minutes, a moderate dwell time, which is in the 1 to 2 hour range, and then an extended one. It's beyond 2 hours, typically in the 4 hour or greater category. It's important to now start to try to isolate to marrying up your business and your average customer's shopping experience and how long they spend at your establishment against the type of EV charger that you would contemplate using in your space. On the next slide, we're going to talk first of all about the rapid dwell time, which is the 10-minute or less category. The best example is in convenience stores. People are only going to see a benefit if you've installed the fast charger. The L2 charger typically is not going to work in this environment at all. What we're seeing in this space is that most retailers are opting in this environment to not actually charge a fee, a per minute fee for the charge, but so it's not direct revenue. The indirect revenue source is from an extended dwell time, because most customers we're finding are willing to wait into the 10 to 15 minute range in some instances to get the charge that they need to keep moving forward as they leave your establishment and go to the next their next stop. If we go to the next page, we've created a matrix which I think pretty well explains what I mean when I talk about an indirect charge. We're making some baseline assumptions here. If we look at that box over on the right in that blue space before we get into the white space of the matrix, based on some statistical data that we're able to pull, we start with some baseline assumptions that in the convenience store environment, average convenience store has about 2,800 customers per week. If we assume that 5% of their customers are using are EV users, it translates into about 140 transactions per week that would be coming through your store. When we go over to the white space now, based on those assumptions, in that first column for a non-EV owner, the average time in store is a little over 3.5 minutes, with an average per minute spend of $2.54, translates into a $9.02 average sale. The column to the right of that is the experience that we're starting to understand better about what happens when the EV customer charges at your store. They're spending 5 minutes on site in your store, and based on that $2.54 average minute spend, it's translating into a bump in revenue to $12.70 versus the $9.02 that the non-EV owner is spending. You've got you're not charging, as I said before, in most instances, they're not charging directly on a permanent charge for the charge. So instead, there's some costs associated with that, though, that you have to factor in. Comes to about 42 cents for a charge for someone who's going to spend that extra few minutes in your store for a total of a 5, 6, 7 minute charge, which translates into a net revenue gain of, it gets you to $12.28 as opposed to the $9.02. So you've got an incremental marginal sale of $3.26. If we go back over to the right and we do the monkey math for you, it translates into an additional $24,000 of additional revenue. And that's just based on a 5% customer makeup using EV, which are 2022 numbers. If you start to extend that out into 23, 24, and 25, and you bump that number up to from 5 to 10 or 15%, you can start to do the math and realize that in 2 or 3 years, if we're at the 15% number, it could translate into upwards of $75,000 a year of incremental revenue. If we go to the next slide, we'll look at that next group that we talked about in terms of developing a strategy, and that's the quick dwell time folks that spend 15 to 30 minutes charging. Good examples there are going to be QSR restaurants, an electronics store, could be a Best Buy type of store, a home goods store, where they're spending an average of 30 minutes plus or minus in your store. In this instance, we still think that DC FC, the fast charger, is still the best option in terms of developing a strategy. It makes a lot of sense, and there are ways now that you can actually start to charge for the per minute charge from the EV charger. If we go to the next slide, we've done a similar exercise for you, and we've created another matrix. And in this matrix, what we see happening using QSR as an example, in a non-EV environment, the average dwell time in a QSR restaurant is about 12 minutes at a table, with about 5 customers an hour, with a $12 average check. The projected revenue per hour is about $60. In the column to the right of that, we see the EV owner. Here, there's a little bit of a trade-off because the customer is actually now spending, as opposed to 12, they're willing to spend about 20 minutes of dwell time in your establishment. So your table turn is a little bit less than for a non-EV owner. So we've reduced that number down from 5 to 3, kept the same check average, but now we're charging for the charge, which translates into over an hour an incremental increase of $8.40. So it takes you from a $60 hour revenue per hour to $68.40 per hour. And again, that's assuming a 5%. So these are 2022 numbers. And based on that hockey puck graph that David showed a few minutes ago, you can anticipate that those numbers in terms of EV users will start to increase pretty drastically over the next few years. All that translates into additional revenue of about $75,000 a year. So that's our second example of dwell time. If we go to the next slide, we'll go to the third example, which is that moderate dwell time in the 1 to 2 hour range. And examples here that we're seeing in some of our clients that we work with are clients like the gyms, grocery stores, a mid-box strip mall, or even a bigger mall where customers are going to spend some extended time on site. In this example now, we're getting away a little bit from just exclusively using the fast chargers, but now we're introducing the L2 chargers. Based upon the variable of some people spending shorter periods, some people spending longer periods, extended periods of time, and trying to understand what that ratio is, and then designing a solution that makes the most sense, a combination of L2 and fast chargers. And on the next slide, I'll give you another example of how we've broken this down a little bit to try and understand it and do the math to help develop a strategy. Is in this particular instance, we're making certain assumptions here. Starts out, if you just look at these bullets, but essentially it's, if we get to that third bullet point, if you have 1,000 customers visit your location in any given day, around 12 people would be using DC-FC chargers, and 38 would be using L2 chargers based on a 25-75 split. So with that kind of baselining to that, from a revenue perspective, in terms of users, we see the 12 for the fast charger, 38 for the L2, and we do the math, work our way down to the bottom, and see that the projected yearly revenue, fast chargers would be a little bit north of $75,000, the L2 about $50,000, about $128,000, $130,000 per year. But again, a well thought out strategy is required here to try to hit the mark as far as average customer dwell time to get the right mix of EV chargers on site. Next slide gets to that last scenario that we had, which are the extended dwell time, which is 4+ hours. For those folks, now we're really starting to get away from the fast charger idea here and really focusing in on the L2s. These can be work well in condo apartment complexes, in hotels. We're seeing a lot of interest, and at stadiums for sporting events, concerts, things like that. And on the next slide, again, lastly, we put another matrix together for you just to kind of give you what that scenario might look like in a condo apartment complex with 1,000 residents. If we work off of some of those same assumptions, 5% of residents, which again will only grow and grow rapidly as time goes by. If we start to do the math on that, we get down to a per unit charger revenue of about $45,500 a year. So those are the four, again, the strategy is based on dwell time, and the dwell time is really a function of your business and what your experience has been in terms of what the average customer time on site is, in developing a strategy based off of that. And on the next slide, I want to give you just a kind of high level idea. There's a lot of variability to these numbers, but an idea of what's my investment going to be and what's it going to look like to get into this space, and what kind of ongoing maintenance might I incur, should I anticipate incurring and budgeting for on a go-forward basis. The L2s, as I said a few minutes ago, the charger itself and the installation typically is significantly less than the fast charger. The rates that you can charge on a per minute basis or for a charge are significantly higher on the fast charger, taking that consideration of the additional costs involved. A lot of the variability has to do with where you're going to install these, what kind of electrical service you currently have, what kind of upgrades you may have to make to your facility to begin to accommodate so that you can install the right chargers. We've got some costs that are in here also that take into consideration the network fees, in terms of being able to put in the 4G or 5G service and get the network installed, which I think everyone on this call will see a benefit to having that network capability, especially from a revenue generating standpoint. And then there's some costs to take into consideration that people don't often think of. What's cost of my permit going to be? What's my ongoing maintenance going to be? So we've laid out some of these costs here so you can start to get an idea. Also make reference over on the right side to a site you can go to that will help you start to understand what type of incentives your local, state, and federal government is offering to you right now as far as tax rebates or credits are concerned, or their ability to underwrite some of the infrastructure costs as part of the investment to get the installation done. Next slide talks about next steps. Some logical next steps to think about is what do you do if you've decided to move forward? First thing is you need to pick an EV provider. Who's your provider going to be? There's several out there. We've worked with a handful of them to date. We've, to an extent, seen kind of the good, the bad, the ugly in this. We have some recommendations that we can make. We can work in concert with you or the provider on a go-forward basis. But the first step is to pick a provider. Once you've picked a provider, we strongly recommend, from our own experience to date, is that you start to engage. If you start to think, you can handle all of this yourself, or you've got the internal team that can do this, there is a learn-up period here that we do recommend minimally that you engage someone who's got some level of expertise in this. We happen to have a lot of experience in this space and have the expertise and can offer to avail ourselves to anyone on the call that might need some consultation as to how to move forward from this point. But you have to lay out the work and understand what your next steps are. You really need to conduct a site survey to figure out, what do you have now? What electrical service do you have? What things do you need to be thinking about in terms of where you're going to pull power from, where you're going to put things, what existing conditions do you have in place that are going to determine the viability, and where on your location and your facility you might think about contemplate installing these. Somebody has to draw up plans, and somebody has to take it to market, get it priced. You have to pull permit in every instance. You have to pull permit, and then engage a contractor to come out and do the work. David's going to touch on a few of these things a little bit more in terms of Sevan's capability in that regard. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over back to him. David?
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate the information. So, overall, we wanted to conclude before we jump into a Q&A, as Mark said, on ultimately how can we pull this off and help you from a speed and scale perspective, add these to some of your sites. So when you think about Sevan, we really like to think of ourselves as your trusted partner, your eyes, your ears, ultimately your thoughts out in the field to really be an extension of your team and get more done at a very fast, scalable, easy way. Ultimately, we've heard from a number of our different customers that they like to think of us as you multiplied, and what we've heard and what we understand that to mean is we ultimately multiply the effects of really our partners, our customers, internal departments. So when you're thinking about a rollout, you're thinking about a reimage, remodel, et cetera, you're able to get there faster and ultimately get to that revenue production and that return at a quicker pace. So when you think about Sevan as a whole, one of the quick questions that we always get is ultimately how can Sevan help and what does that mean? So as Mark alluded to, and we spoke about at the beginning of this conversation, we've installed hundreds and thousands of these across the United States as well as in the European Union, and we really have it down pat. So what Sevan can do is we can help you with feasibility, understand what sites it should be on, help you with your model and understanding from an ROI calculation where on that site it ultimately should be placed. Again, not only with regulations but also feasibility, traffic, et cetera. We'll then put that in drawings and ultimately stamp those and be able to implement that, get it approved, grab the permits, and then ultimately work with a number of different contractors as well as equipment vendors to get the hardware on site, get the right electrical current to the site, and then manage that installation to ultimately commission and revenue production. So at the end of the day, we start at the beginning and we provide a full suite of services that is a turnkey approach to help you add those electric vehicle chargers to your ultimate sites and again, get to that end phase as quick as possible. So at the end of the day, when you partner with Sevan, you get our strength, our experience, our commitment to safety, a customized approach because every site's different, every goal is different, every customer experience is different. So we really sit down with you and strategize and say, what do you want to accomplish at what pace, at what time? And then we work together to ultimately get there. As I said at the beginning, these are all of our colleagues, all of our employees. We really value our level of service, our experience, and most importantly, our execution. And know that's really where the rubber meets the road and allows you to be successful and accomplish what you need to accomplish. So at the end of the day, the strength that Sevan is and the strength created by our colleagues, our experience, our commitments, and our collaborative and customized approach provides strength to you and helps you get to those goals at a faster pace. So at this point, I thought we would just turn it over to back to Mary Ann just for a quick question answer session, and then we'll let everybody get on with their day.
Okay, thanks, David. We have plenty of questions, so let's dive right in. Our first question is, does EV charging start at level 2? What about level 1?
Hi, Mary Ann, it's Mark. I'll take that. As I mentioned in my slides, level 1 is really confined for home use, for residential use, primarily because of the fact that you cannot, under any of those 4 scenarios that we talked about, from that rapid dwell time to that extended dwell time, you cannot adequately charge a car for at an L1 charge. So we really start the conversation. L1 is reserved for home use. Is in the garage, may take you 20 to 40 hours to charge your car to get a full charge if your battery's been depleted. We really start the conversation for commercial application at L2. And those are usually those a little bit longer dwell times. And as you're developing your strategy, and the fast charge really makes a lot of sense in those first couple scenarios we talked about.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Here's another question. Are EV charger ports all the same?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I've had to learn that from watching some folks and their frustration pull up to charging stations and trying to understand whether or not the charger is compatible with their particular car. The short answer is that no, they're not all the same, but they're by and large at the L1 and L2 level. That situation it solves itself because of the universal charger adapters, and they're being used right now. Once we get into the fast charging space, we get into Tesla's got their own proprietary charger adapter, but they work at Tesla stations. But there are adapters that they can Tesla owners can get that allow them to use the other EV charging stations that are available. So the industry's addressed the question, and by and large, about 95% of the chargers that are in place right now across the country, there is a solution between the EV provider and the manufacturers providing the right adapters for people to have access to. In most situations, 95% of the time, they're able to get a charge at a station that they pull up to.
Okay, here's another question. How long do EV stations take to install?
Mary Ann, I'll take this one if it's all right with you, Mark.
Sure.
Okay, excellent. So in a nutshell, it really depends. So there is definitely a pre-construction phase that can take a couple of months just due to understanding regulations, getting the required permits, going through the plan phase and the feasibility side. But once everything's stamped, ready to go, a typical piece of hardware with the electrical current is up and ready to go within 3 to 6 weeks. But on average, it's a 2 to 3 month entire process of I decide I want to add a charger to I'm turning revenue or producing revenue.
Okay, someone out there says, I hear chargers are already becoming obsolete. How do I know my chargers won't become obsolete in a few years?
Again, another great question. So the good news is that as technology continues to advance, it's really around utilizing the current that's available. And so the hardware that exists that was 3G technology is somewhat coming obsolete today, but what's being installed on a go-forward basis is 4G and 5G technology, which has a shelf life of roughly 10 to 15 years. So at a minimum, you'll get a 10-year time period where you have the ability to use that piece of hardware without hardware upgrades. Clearly, the software and some of the other things will be upgraded, which is typically included in the maintenance cost, but the hardware won't need to be changed for that time period.
Okay, so let's see. Here's another question. If I am a tenant, can I make money from EV charging?
Another good question. Got a bright group of people on the call today, asking a lot of smart questions, Mary Ann. So we have a lot of instances where we work for clients who are tenants in a multi-tenant building. Maybe they have the end cap. Maybe they're in the middle of the strip center, and the landlord is decided that they're going to install some EV charging stations. Assuming that the default standard seems to be right now and going forward is that the EV charging stations are being installed with network capability. That allows for a lot of things, and I'll just speak to two of them. One is that on the screen of the EV charger itself, there's an opportunity for advertising, and working with a landlord, the tenants can figure out how they can sequence advertising marketing on the screen to try to capture that potential customer while they're in the lot getting a charge. The second thing is that there's a lot of people are deploying geofencing, solution here, where if you're on the network and the network knows that there's a charging station there, and if you take advantage of the geofencing, is that they can capture potential customers in a proximate area to the center itself, into a multi-tenant building or into a building that you're a tenant of. and start pushing advertising and marketing directly to the customer cell phone. So yeah, there are opportunities up there, even though there might not be the opportunity for the direct revenue of a per minute charge.
Okay. Here's one. Can EV stations be installed at parking spots that are marked accessible?
Yeah, we've actually had this come up in a few instances, and we've dealt with this. The short answer is yes, you can. You cannot compromise, though, on an ADA space, on a handicap space. So you have to still meet the minimum requirements of the local or regional jurisdiction, as far as at a federal level too, the regulations that apply to that. What you cannot do, though, is you cannot take a dedicated handicap space and turn it into a non-handicap charging space, because you'll go afoul of the rules and regulations minimally at a local level if you do that.
Okay. A few people wanted to know, are charging stations weatherproof?
Mark, I'll take this one as well. So if your stations are located outside, it's important to just make sure that you've got the right protection from the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, which is a 3 rating. And what we've seen so far is all the hardware is at that rating. So it's definitely designed to be outside, be in different environments, and still be safe and revenue producing. Now, at the same time, if there's a flood, I wouldn't recommend plugging in an electric vehicle for charging in standing water, just to be safe. But if it's raining, not an issue whatsoever.
Okay, well, that kind of segs into another question. Are there safety concerns with EV chargers?
Not really. So that they are pretty safe. They were designed to be safe. There's standards. Are there nuances? Sure. It's really no different risk than what you would get at a gas station. It's just a different type of risk. So there's always the exception, but there's electrical shock risk, there's fire risk, but again, very, very minimal, just based off the hardware, the installation, et cetera. But everything follows the same safety protocols, same standards, same inspections that you would get at a gas station. But so very, very minimal risk when you tie it all together.
What does it mean for an EV charger to be networked?
Well, I spoke to that a little bit a few minutes ago, Miriam, but just to I'll expand on it a little bit. The naming convention in the industry for a networked EV charger, it's called plug and charge technology. So in a I'll give you a couple instances where non-networked EV chargers might make sense in your home. Definitely number one, maybe in a housing development, apartment, condo complex, where you're not too concerned about pricing structure, changing pricing, data collection, the marketing things we talked about a few minutes ago, the geofencing. But in most commercial applications, as I said, you're going to want to install that network capability, even though there's an incremental cost to that to install and then maintain that. You're going to want that networked EV charging station so that you can push pricing, pull data out. You can change pricing depending upon time of day if you need to. Without the network connection, you're not able to really do the type of marketing advertising you'd otherwise be able to do, and you're not going to be able to do the geofencing. So they call that the plug and charge technology. And for most commercial applications, it's just becoming the default standard going forward.
Okay. Well, here's a good question. How do I ensure people charging their EVs don't stay in a spot too long?
Yeah, I referenced this a little bit, and I didn't really touch on it. We call that hybrid pricing. So one of the things that the frustrations that the owners of the EV charging stations have been encountering the last couple of years as this technology is starting to roll out and it's starting to ramp up. Some things that people didn't necessarily think about fully bake the idea a couple of years ago was what happens if somebody pulls up on site and they set up for they pay for a 5-minute, 7-8 minute charge, and they plug in and they get in their car, or they run into the store, they get what they need, and then they come back to the car, and the car is charged, and they hop in the car and they hop on their cell phone and get on a call for the next 10 or 15 minutes while you're not getting charged. And you've got that additional extended dwell time, but you're not getting the revenue associated with it. So what the solution to that is, a lot of folks have come up with a hybrid pricing model now, where there is a specific charge for while the charger is active and it's charging the battery. But if you have an extended dwell time and you just hang out in your car and you're on a phone call, but you're still plugged in, the technology now, it can identify that you're there, you're plugged in, you're not charging, but you're still there. So there's a reduced charge that they'll put in play then. So they'll pay them is almost like they're charging on a permanent rental of that parking space to occupy that. So they're developing these hybrid pricing models. Now that doesn't work, and we still haven't necessarily, as an industry, haven't solved for people who just pull into an EV charging station, into a stall, and don't charge and get on that 15-20 minute phone call. That's where I guess we just revert back to the old technology of slapping a sign there and say that there's no, they're not allowed to just park there under threat of getting towed, I guess. But something that technology hasn't solved for in that part, for that part of it yet.
Not yet. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I just want to ask if either of you have anything to say before we close.
Thanks, Marianne. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with this group. Appreciate the time of the attendees. We did get about 30 more questions. We did hit the top 10. So we will circle back with the individuals that ask questions and provide you an answer. At the same time, if you'd like to have a one-to-one conversation or gain some additional information, feel free to reach out to Mark or myself. You also can go to sevensolutions.com and request some additional information. We also have a white paper that we've published around this subject. That's a great area that you can gain some additional knowledge as well. But we look forward to speaking with each of you in the future and helping you with your electric vehicle charging installations and implementations. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, David. And once again, thanks to Sevan Multi-Site Solutions for sponsoring their webinar and for your expertise. And I also want to thank all of our attendees for devoting the time to be with us today. One last thing, remember this webinar will shortly be available on demand, so you can listen to it again. There are things you want to check back on or share it with your colleagues. That's it. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.